Dr. Sanjay Gupta, welcome to the show.
What a pleasure, Dan. I've been watching you for years. I'm a huge fan of yours. You know, I got to say, you're one of those guys who on television, even when you're not speaking, you convey a lot. And it always makes me feel better as a viewer. So just wanted to tell you that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, my wife says I have a very bad resting bitch face. So
with all due respect to your wife, I would say the opposite. You always seem like you got a little bit of a smile on your face. Sometimes whimsical, sometimes I don't know what, but it's always there.
Well, thank you for that. And right back at you. It feels like a kind of a version of malpractice that we haven't had you on the show until now. So I apologize to our listeners for that oversight, and very excited to have you on, and big admirer of yours. And so, and I have a lot of questions I want to ask you.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, hopefully we can make up for this lost time by doing a really good chat today.
Yeah, I have full confidence in that. You wrote a book a few years ago that I'm regretting not having talked to you at the time, but I have you now, and it's called Keep Sharp, and it's really something that I think is of universal interest, which is how do we maintain brain health for as long as possible. And you had this very handy sort of 5 pillars, 5 ways that we can think about keeping our brains healthy. And so I was going to move through these sequentially. The first is to move your body. Can you say it? Actually, you know what? Before we get into that, let me ask you a higher level question, which is a little bit of your origin story. Like, how did you get interested in the brain in the first place?
You know, it's interesting. I started medical school at a pretty young age. I was accepted to medical school out of high school. And so I was pretty young. And when I first started medical school, I thought I was going to probably go into pediatrics. I was really, when I watched pediatricians in the hospital, they were kind of always the best doctors, Dan. I think it's something about taking care of sick children that galvanizes teams. And these doctors were just, they were such pleasant human beings. They never wanted to check out early. They wanted to take care of their patients. And I thought pediatrics. And then I did a rotation in neurosurgery when I was in medical school. And I think this is sort of a common story for a lot of medical students. You get this exposure. You didn't even know you had an interest. And all of a sudden it's sort of, changes your whole trajectory. So I became very interested in the brain. My grandfather had a stroke when I was in my early teens, and that was the first time I sort of thought about the mysteries of the brain. He had this really interesting condition where he could write, but he could not read. He could speak, but he could not understand. So he was able to express, but not receive, to the point where he could write something down and not read what he just wrote. I mean, it was really and it made me very just curious, like, how does this work? Like, the heart's a pump. The pancreas makes insulin. You kind of have a functional sort of idea, but the brain was just so different. And that got me sort of interested as well. So, I went to 7 years of neurosurgery training, a year of fellowship, and my love for the brain continued to grow.
It is a 3.5-pound mystery that we're carrying around in our skulls.
The most enigmatic 3.5 pounds of tissue in the known universe.
And there's so many mysteries, too, like in the connection between the brain and the mind. I know you've spent some time with the Dalai Lama, and I have that on my long list of questions for you. But in the Tibetan tradition, if you ask a monk or a nun to point to their mind, they will point to their heart. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But most of us think of the mind as predicated upon the brain. And so there's just a lot there that we don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, the emotional centers of the brain versus the intellectual centers of the brain, and the thinking brain versus the reactive brain, all of that, I think gets at this notion of the mind-brain dichotomy. And it's interesting because, being a neurosurgeon, you're taught in a very sort of functional way. Here is the right frontal lobe. It is responsible for XYZ. Left temporal lobe does this. And yet, as we learn more and more about the brain, and we can peer inside the brain in ways that we couldn't before, we see that it's really like this constellation of things like in the sky that are happening all at different times. So even though you're speaking, we thought that was all left temporal lobe. You see the right parietal lobe linking up as well. And I guess my point is those connections between things is probably the mind, whereas the brain is kind of like the big cities of a particular state, all the roads in between that sort of connect those cities. that make it all work in a way, I think is the mind. People have different views on this, and I think it'll be something that won't be settled maybe in human history. And it'll be a topic of discussion, like where does consciousness really reside? And what does that mean for the mind versus the brain? It's fascinating stuff. And I love having this kind of conversation. It's literally why when I was a medical student, I decided to do this. As much as I wanted to do the technical aspects of brain surgery, I love these conversations. And so I just knew that if I was a brain guy, I get to have them all the time.
There's a reason why they call consciousness the hard problem. How did we go, as one poet has said, from like gases and rocks to opera? Like, how did that happen is very interesting, and nobody that I know of has the answer. And it's coming to mind.
Can I just say something?
Please,
if you want to apply the functional aspects of what you just said, so the brain functional aspects, left motor strip controls right side of body, right motor strip controls left side of body. We have these direct sort of relationships we make, but gas and rocks to opera, that is not a direct connection. And there's no part of sort of survival of what, the adaptive traits of human beings that would allow us to better survive. Opera was probably not on the list. And yet somehow it is there. Like, I mean, your whole podcast is about happiness, but I think one would have a hard time making the case that happiness is a necessary trait for survival, right? And yet we desire it deeply. And so, that's the same sort of metaphor that we use for the mind to the brain, we could make for opera to gas and rocks. It's kind of that thing, exactly what you're saying.
And then you get into the question of, you theorize that maybe the brain represents the major cities and the mind is the connection among all of these sort of faculties of knowing that we have within the organism. But, if I've spent a little bit of time in the Buddhist world, and the one of the main contentions there is that it is unknowable. Like, there's this great Zen parable of this. I think it's a Zen parable, and I'm going to probably mangle this, but some aspiring meditation student is waiting outside of a cave where a great master is studying, and he's trying to get this master to come out and help him. And he asks the master, "Hey, can you help me pacify my mind?" And the master says, "Bring me your mind and I'll show you how to do it." And the point is, like, you can't find this thing. And in the not finding, that is the finding. Like, to get familiar with the fact that if you close your eyes and look for Dr. Gupta, you can't find him. There's something healing in the proximity to the mystery. Am I making any sense here as I ramble?
Totally. I had not heard that parable before, but I totally, I get it. And I think these things are sometimes hard to get your head around, or your mind around, if you will, in the moment. But I will say that I'm in my mid-50s now. And I think for a long time, I was sort of under the belief that I needed to find answers to questions. And I still have that desire. It's not like it's gone, but I think I'm much more comfortable with what you just said, the idea that maybe some things are just unknowable. I mean, I've always known that, but it's like, we need to be figuring it out. We need to do the best we can to figure out the answers to these questions. But the idea that it is unknowable, maybe that is the answer, is liberating in a way. It's sort of freeing, take some of the pressure off.
Do you think there's something about the human animal that with age, our brain, our mind, whatever, gets more comfortable, or at least in some individuals, with ambiguity, with open-mindedness, with intellectual humility, which, by the way, as a side note, maybe not even that much of a side note, seems desperately lacking in our modern political culture?
The way I'd answer that is that I think it is the case for some people, but not for everyone who ages. Do our brains develop that sort of comfort with ambiguity or whatever it may be? I was having this conversation with someone recently about confidence, and this was a confidence researcher, and he was basically making the case that confidence in and of itself is a virtue. And almost advocating for the fake it till you make it sort of thing, because through that, even if you're faking it, you will be more likely to try things. And the more shots you take on goal, the more likely you're to have success. So just if you're to teach your kids some sort of trait, teaching them to be confident is really important. Now, some would say, well, you got to make sure they're not arrogant, and that's true. You got to have the right amount of confidence. But I think that the idea of what is sort of how you sort of balance that in your life is important. So I think as I've gotten older, maybe I've gotten more comfortable with ambiguity, but I would also say this: in some ways, I've become less confident. I think I've become somebody who, the more that I know, the more that I realize I don't know. and I guess I'm not sure that gets at your question of ambiguity, but I think that's kind of how my mind sort of responds to that. I'm less confident, and that doesn't paralyze me, but I'm aware of it. It makes me a better listener, I think. I don't talk as much, and I listen more.
Well, I wonder, it's kind of like a definitional question of how are you defining confidence? Because I scan your decreasing dogmatism as a form of confidence. Like, it takes confidence to get comfortable with open-mindedness, with intellectual humility, to admit that you don't know.
Right. I guess you're right. I mean, the confidence in the sense that why didn't you do that before? Because you were afraid you'd be judged, maybe diminished as a result of coming off as someone who wasn't confident about something. And now I guess I'm confident enough not to care about that as much, I guess. I don't know. I guess that's probably true. I care, but I don't care so much, about how the people view me. Does that happen in the mid-50s? I don't know. I think I'm probably older than you, but I think over the last few years, it's become more pronounced, I would say.
Well, I'm 53. I feel it starting to happen with me. I have lots of insecurities for sure, but it's getting better.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm being Pollyannish here. I still have insecurities, but I think for some of the big, like the big issues, not the superficial stuff, but the bigger issues, I'm more comfortable not being so dogmatic about it, and being willing to I tell my friends I like spending time with people I disagree with, because the people I agree with, I don't feel like I'm going to learn anything, and not to malign them, and I'm just saying that conversation I know, it's well worn. The people I disagree with, as long as they're not malignant jerks, are actually pretty fun conversations to have.
Just to put a plug in here, your reference to having a conversation recently about confidence is a reference to your podcast, Chasing Life, which people should check out. And I saw that you had a confidence expert on there, and I actually sent a note to my team to say, hey, we should look into this person, the confidence expert. So listeners, if you hear a confidence episode in your feed soon, you can thank Dr. Gupta.
And you can be confident it will be a good episode.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's talk about the 5 pillars for better brain health. The first is moving your body. I guess it's sort of somewhat performatively naive question here is like, what's the connection between moving your whole body and having a healthy brain, which is just a small part of it?
I'll preface by saying this: even since I graduated from medical school, which was 30 years ago now, one of the big sort of things that's happened in the world of neuroscience is the understanding of how possible neurogenesis is. Neurogenesis, the growing of new brain cells. When I was in medical school, the general belief when it came to certain tissues in the body, including the brain, was that once the brain was fully developed, you had a certain number of neurons, certain number of supporting cells to those neurons, and that was it. You had that amount of brain, and over your life, you would drain the cache, and certain things would speed up that drainage, like alcohol, for example. But I think we know that that's not the case now. We know that we can grow new brain cells at any age. And I'll tell you, it's really interesting, and I'll talk about movement in a second, but I'll tell you, it's really interesting that the way that we know you can grow new brain cells at any age is kind of interesting. We only really looked at the brain when there was a problem, when there was a tumor, when there was trauma, something like that. Once we started to be able to look at the healthy brain through this really remarkable technology, we saw that there was evidence of neurogenesis happening all the time. There was this turnover of brain cells and new brain cells being replenished all the time, which was pretty revelatory. We didn't really know that happened. So now we know, and then the question became, okay, now we know we can grow new brain cells at any age. How do I do it? And you can't inject it, you can't eat it, you can't take it as a supplement. The only way you can do it is to make these new brain cells yourself. And one of the ways to do that is through this factor known as BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You may know all this, Dan. I'm sure this has maybe hit your radar, but it's pretty interesting. BDNF is sort of, as a very famous neuroscientist put it to me, it's like the miracle grow for the brain. You sprinkle this stuff on the brain and you get neurogenesis. I'm simplifying, but that's kind of the idea. And what they found when they started to look at lots and lots of data was one of the best ways to make BDNF was through movement. And when your body was in movement, you actually were actively expressing BDNF. And they got so granular about it, they realized that if you were moving too lightly or too slowly, you probably weren't making much BDNF. If you were moving moderately or excessively or sort of intense exercise, you're making a lot of BDNF. But the difference was when you're intensely exercising, you're also making a lot of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And that stress hormone actually inhibits BDNF. So you find that there's a sweet spot when it comes to movement and the brain. And too little is not making enough BDNF. Too much is making BDNF, but also making things that suppress BDNF. So brisk movement, more moderate movement, is actually better for the brain, whereas intense activity may be better for the heart. So we always say that exercise is good, but we're starting to get to the point where we can be pretty prescriptive and granular about what types of movement is better for what. So, for me, I love exercise. I've been doing it my whole life. I will do an intense exercise every day, swim, bike, or run. And I'll probably go for a kind of briskish walk with my wife and my dogs at some point as well. I try and do that. Some days are a little harder than others, but one's good for the heart, one's good for the brain.
That's so interesting. So if you're doing a HIIT workout, high intensity interval training, or really, which you can get in a spin class or doing sprints while you're running or swimming or whatever, that is good for the heart, but it's not going to lead to a lot of BDNF. Whereas if you take a brisk walk every day, that's probably not as good for the heart, but it's better for the brain.
That's right. And to be clear, with the intense exercise, you're making a lot of BDNF, but you're also suppressing it because you're making a lot of cortisol. It's almost like, it's fascinating. And I'll keep coming back to this brain-mind thing again, because functionally you can kind of get that. You raise your heart rate, you improve oxygenated blood, all that sort of stuff. But the fact that we evolved into making moderate activity sort of the type of activity that was more likely to make adequate BDNF and not suppress it is interesting, right? I mean, the longest lived societies in the world, they don't really run. They walk. I mean, these guys in Bolivia, the Chamane tribe, which was considered sort of the healthiest people in the world for a point, they would walk to hunt. They didn't outrun their prey. They outlasted their prey. And on average, they do about 17,000 steps per day. But there was never like these intense activity, maybe just at the point where they're actually throwing a spear or a bow and arrow, whatever. But most of the time, it was moderate activity, probably making a ton of BDNF, and really seemed to work for them.
I'm not an evolutionary expert, but it does make sense if you think about the fact that we evolved to be walking and thinking at the same time. A lot of our, we had to have situational awareness, moving through the savannah for hunting and for threat detection, et cetera, et cetera. So I've heard from experts on this show that actually movement is good for decision-making and creativity. And it would also just go to follow that a good amount of moderate exercise, given our evolutionary history, would be good for the brain.
Yes. And, you could almost imagine the BDNF being sprinkled on your brain when you're taking a brisk walk. And the fact that you're like, I just thought of this other thing I wanted to ask for a podcast, or all these things come into your head all of a sudden as you're doing it. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of like that's the way the body was designed, to be in motion and to be better when it was in motion. To do things that we think of as intellectual, but actually when you're in motion, we think of those things sitting at a desk, because that is how we evolved. Who was a proponent of this was Steve Jobs. I don't know if you had read that in
Walking
Isaacson's
Meetings.
book, Walking Meetings.
Yeah.
That was the big thing. And I think a lot of people do that now, but there's some scientific underpinning to why that would work.
One of the things that I imagine comes up in people's minds when they hear us talking about the value of exercise for brain health is, I can't make the habit stick. I'm one of those people who starts to exercise on January 1st, or maybe January 2nd. Once I get over the hangover, I, like most people, lose the habit before February arrives. What do you say to people who struggle in that regard?
I think they're viewing it as a punishment almost, something they have to do, the obligated broccoli eating, And this is, frankly, since I've been a medical journalist, this has been one of the biggest challenges. And I think we see it in the medical world as well. But I think as a journalist, it was more clear to me that we are fundamentally telling people to do things like eat right and exercise. And guess what? Nothing will happen to you. It's not the most inspiring message in the world. The benefits that you're going to accrue are 30, 40, 50 years down the line when you delay that heart attack or stroke or whatever it might be. With all kinds of messaging, including this, breaking your habit, within the first couple of months, is that you got to close the loop for people. If you do these things, you will be better now. It's not just about warding disease off 30, 40 years from now. You will be better now. You'll feel better. You'll be a better spouse, a better brother, better sister, better employee, better colleague, whatever it might be. You will be happier. You'll be more productive. All those things now as a result of those things. I think that's always been the challenge. When we talk even in prevention as a conceit in medicine, it's hard for people to get their heads around that. I got to do all this stuff to prevent something that may or may not happen in the first place. But here's the secret is that you will feel better now. So, I think I tell people when it comes to habits like that to keep a journal, keep a food journal, and keep a journal sort of how you're feeling. And I think you'll realize that when you're adopting these healthy habits, some of the ones that we're talking about, you'll feel better now, and you won't feel as good if you stop doing it. So that can be, I think, motivating for people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If we're going to go from extrinsic motivation, meaning Dr. Gupta tells me I should do it, to intrinsic motivation, which is I'm doing this exercise because I want to do it. One way to get over the hump is to pay close attention through a journal or any other tracking mechanism to how you're feeling, like the upside, the dopamine that you're getting out of this thing that you're dreading, as a way to convince your system that actually, no, you want to do this for your own reasons.
Yeah, totally. And the journaling really helps because, the biggest lies we tell are the lies we tell ourselves. And if you keep a journal, I think it kind of forces you to be honest. Like if you had, I don't know if you've ever kept a food journal, but you have a meal and then a few hours later really ask yourself, how do you feel? How did that meal make you feel? I found something interesting, which is that whenever I ate fermented foods, like pickles or something, actually a few hours later or a couple hours later, I felt really good. I felt, I don't know, I felt like I would be a better writer, I would be more creative, whatever. So fermented foods probably nourishing my microbiome in some way, which is our second brain, our gut is, and I feel better. So here I got this secret weapon now. Pickles, as a result of keeping a food journal. It really helps.
Good to know. I'm taking a lot of notes here. Okay, the second pillar, stretch your mind. So the first was move your body. The second is stretch your mind. What do you mean by that? It's
really based on the adage that you should try and do something that scares you every day. Do things that get you outside of your comfort zone. Try new things. Here's the basic idea is that, when we think about the brain, people often ask, do you use your whole brain or is it more like the Cheech and Chong movie? We only use 20% of our brain. So, you can do whatever you want with the other 80%. That's not the case. We use our whole brain. But kind of like I was describing earlier, there are the cities and then there's the roads. So the cities are the most important part of the brain, and that's probably, 20% of your brain. But unless you can get from city to city with those roads, those cities are isolated. They don't do anything. So you need the roads, even though the roads aren't populated all the time, if that makes sense. So you do use your whole brain. And so when you stretch your brain, what I'm basically saying is that most of us, even though we use our whole brain, we probably use 10% of it 90% of the time. So it's kind of like Dan Harris lives in his house, lives in his neighborhood, and never travels anywhere else. And he gets so good at living there that he can drive those roads with his eyes closed. He knows everybody. He knows every cashier at the supermarket, everything about that place. But there's 90% of the world still left that you haven't really explored. if you do things that you do over and over again and get really good at them, like crossword puzzles or Sudoku, things like that, it's kind of like getting even better at knowing your city. But once you start to do things that are uncomfortable, that are unusual, that maybe even get you outside your comfort zone, make you a little scared even, it's kind of like now you've become a psychonaut. Now you can travel around your brain and have other areas of your brain actually do things that you hadn't done before. For example, during the pandemic, I remember I took up painting. I am a terrible, terrible artist. Awful. I draw stick figures. But I said I'm going to take up painting, and I started doing it with my left hand. So here was a brand new activity that's outside my comfort zone, using a little bit of a motor component, because I'm painting with my hand, using my non-dominant hand, because I'm right-handed, was a way to do something that totally stretched my brain. It stretched my brain. I mean, I could feel my brain stretching as I'm trying to draw the perfect thing with my left hand. Brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand, eating with your non-dominant hand, doing things that are every door you open, never reach with it for your right hand. If you're right-handed, always open a door with your left hand. Starting to really, all that stuff trains your brain in a different way and stretches it because, again, your mannerisms, your habits at 53 years old have created really, really deep crevasses in certain parts of your brain. Think of those as really, really established roads. But a lot of your brain out there is smooth, doesn't have a lot of roads on it. And to get those roads, you have to do new things. So that's really what it is. And it fights a little bit at this notion of, I think, brain training overall as a conceit, because I think that's kind of like, again, driving the road even better, driving it faster, driving it with my eyes closed. But you've already driven that road. You know that road. So it's like how to drive new roads, I think, is what stretching your brain really is.
So you said this before, but I want to make sure that I understand it. I think there are a non-trivial percentage of people out there who play the crossword or Wordle or whatever it is because they enjoy it, but also because they're hoping to keep their brain healthy and stave off dementia. But I think what you're saying is fine, probably not bad for you, but right. It's really when you get into areas of novelty and fresh challenge, that you're going to stretch the mind in a way that helps the brain.
Yeah, that's right. I get a lot of emails after I wrote the book about these puzzlers. They feel very strongly about their crossword puzzles. And they're like, wait a second, I've been doing these. And I think the way you framed it is exactly right. It's not that that's a bad thing, but just, the analogy I'm sort of giving is that you're getting really, really good at doing this particular type of activity. Like, if people said, what does crossword puzzle sort of behavior, people who do these sorts of things over and over again, make you really good at? What it makes you really good at is crossword puzzles. So great. That's terrific. But there's a lot of other things out there. That's sort of the point. Maybe a lot of crossword puzzlers who are listening to this will also start painting with their left hand or their non-dominant hand. Who knows? But I'm saying there's different ways to stretch the brain.
Even just doing the crossword with their left hand and writing the words in there. That strikes me as a very small but eminently operationalizable hack for brain health that I had never thought of before, which is, can you get into the habit of opening doors, in my case, with my left hand, my non-dominant hand? And you're saying that actually is potentially quite beneficial.
Yeah, look, most of what you do, so from a motor standpoint, most of what you do is probably with the right side of your body. Even the more forceful step that you take going up a flight of stairs, you're probably going with your right and then sort of dragging your left up a little bit. Everything. So if you were to look at the now left motor strip, okay, because the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, if you looked at that, that's probably really, really well established. What's not as well established is probably your right motor strip. And so think about it from a functional standpoint. If you had a stroke one day and you really were now counting on the right side of your brain to become plastic and to be able to take over activities, the better sort of established it is now, earlier in life when you don't have these problems, the more likely it is going to be resilient later on when you need that sort of hemisphere of your brain to be doing other things. So little things. So tonight, try brushing your teeth with your left hand. I won't suggest drinking soup with your left hand right away. I got a couple cleaning bills from that, but just little things like that you can adapt, I think do make a big difference.
Okay, so other things that you've listed, I believe, in the stretch your mind category: learning a new language, taking a cooking class. Also, you've talked about something called speed processing games. What's that?
There was several of them that came out a few years ago, but basically trying to look for patterns very, very quickly and to eliminate other patterns very, very quickly. That's a lot of processing speed. If you think about, the types of functions that we think about in terms of a healthy brain, memory, obviously, judgment, executive judgment, skills, and then processing speed. And processing speed really ends up being probably the most important thing to people when you really start to really survey what they want out of their brain, what they wish their brain would do better. The memory, really, for most people, it's there. They're just not processing it fast enough. So there's a lot of brain training around that. Despite what I just said about brain training sort of making those roads even deeper and more traveled, I think certain brain training exercises that focus on processing speed can actually be really beneficial.
If we want to find one of these, what do you have recommendations?
Yeah, they're it's going to sound funny, but I can't remember. Give me a minute and I'll get back to you. I think there was one that was called double something. I will I'll get to you, I promise.
You're losing it, doctor.
Right? I mean, does that just obviate everything I've just said? Obviously nothing's working for this guy.
You were starting to say something and I rudely cut you off. Something about when you wrote the book.
When I wrote the book, it was interesting because I remember thinking, keep sharp. Who is mostly going to want to read this book? And I think I didn't want it to be just for people who were imminently worried about brain health. I want it to be for everybody, like anybody who writes a book does. But it was interesting when the areas that I wrote about processing speed, I got a lot of feedback and comments and response from like Wall Street guys, people who are trying to make lots and lots of decisions very quickly. And they're looking at lots of data and then trying to see these patterns. And I think the question they were sort of asking is, okay, I'm kind of practicing this all the time because that's my job. But the guys who are really good at this are the guys who are the most successful. How do I get better at this? Which I thought was interesting. I expected people who are worried about dementia, and these are guys who are trying to look at complex patterns of numbers and geopolitical events and make these big decisions on investments. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
What did you recommend to them?
Well, no, same sort of thing. Some of these same brain training exercises that focus on literally like the idea of being able to recognize a pattern. Like one of the games I remember was a really crowded highway of cars, and to quickly be able to pick out a specific pattern of car within all of that chaos out there. The blue convertible car with a certain type of hubcap. Obviously, if you scan the whole photo, you can find that. But how do you start to develop patterns in your own brain to rule out other things very quickly and focus in on what you think is the most important? That's really what a lot of these processing speed brain training exercises are really focusing on. As much as what it's telling you to do, it's telling you what not to do, meaning what to ignore, which is really important.
What's your take on video games? Does that stretch the mind in a healthy way?
I think they can. There was a company called Achille, which created these games for example, with children with ADHD, and they were looking at some of the speed processing stuff that we were talking about, and they were trying to measure it. So they were trying to figure out, like, if you did these games regularly, did you actually get better? Not just at the game, because they would test you in different ways, but did you get better with your processing speed overall? And I think there was data to suggest that was the case. So I think, like a lot of things, it depends, but I think there can be a role for video games. This doesn't all have to be sort of real life sort of stuff. I think doing stuff on the screen can actually be quite helpful.
Yeah, I had a friend years ago who went into hospice and was told he had 3 days to live.
Oh my gosh.
And he ended up in hospice for 6 years. They finally sent him home.
Wow.
And I think it was multifactorial. They might have been wrong about the diagnosis/prognosis. When he went into hospice, he was like the mayor of that place and was very happy. And I think that extended his life. But he also played a ton of video games. A ton. I used to play, Call of Duty with him all the time. I hate video games. And I just wonder a little bit about whether that, helped his brain because you could see he was leaning forward in his bed. He was deeply engaged. He wasn't just sitting back and sipping apple juice.
No, it's that's quite a story, by the way. Man, I'm glad he lived 6 years. That's crazy. What I think is interesting is that simply thinking about things activates parts of our brain. So if you think about music, you're not singing, you're not playing an instrument, not at a concert, you're in an MRI machine, and you can see parts of your brain light up as if you were actually singing or playing an instrument. So when you sort of think about that with regard to video games, obviously the knock on them is that you're just sitting there, doing nothing, except moving a joystick around or whatever it might be. But your brain is actually quite active in those situations, so I think it gets in the way of physical activity for our kids and things like that. So that's a problem. But beyond that, I think there can be a real brain benefit to it, as long as it's not too toxic or taking too much of your time.
The third pillar is resting your body and brain.
Everyone knows we should sleep more, right? I mean, it's like, I remember when I started to write this part of the book, I was thinking, and I think I felt like this for a lot of my career, frankly, is that telling people things they kind of already know, but the what of it is interesting, but the why behind it is far more interesting. So when it comes to the idea of rest or sleep and the brain, it's a little counterintuitive, because there can be a lot happening in our brain when we are sleeping. There can be a lot of activity happening in our brain. We think of ourselves going into the state of sleep paralysis, where just everything is sort of hibernating. And with your brain, you could have a lot going on, a lot of activity. And there's two really important things beyond the fact that you might be consolidating thoughts and things. One is that you're taking short-term memories and you're moving them into the long-term memory stores. And that's really important. I mean, this comes up, I have 3 teenagers, 19, 17, and 15, and this always comes up with their studying. They're studying late into the night and trying to pull an all-nighter before an exam. And I'm telling them that by not sleeping, all the stuff that they're learning right then is not going to get stored in those long-term memory stores for the exam. So they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Long-term memories get made while you sleep. So that's an important thing. The other thing I think is really interesting, and we've learned this recently, is that there's in our body the lymphatic system, your lymph nodes, and those clear the waste from your body. That's what your lymph nodes do. In your brain, you have a glymphatic system, which is sort of the same thing. You need to clear waste when you have all these cellular byproducts. You need to clear that waste. That's happening all the time in the brain, but it happens much more efficiently when you sleep. So the what is that you should get enough sleep. The why is that you're not going to remember long-term things as well. The why is that you're not going to clear the waste out of your brain as well. And the why is that there's a lot of consolidation of thoughts that happens while you dream. It's why you have all these various sort of, thoughts that happen in your brain, even when you're at rest. So there's a lot that's going on there. And I think when you imagine that and picture that when you're trying to get a good night's sleep, I think it makes you more likely to turn off the TV or put away the phone or do whatever and actually go to bed, go to sleep.
What else falls into the category of resting the body and the brain?
We really wanted to use the word rest, maybe even more so than sleep, because rest, I think, comes in all sorts of different forms. Sleep, I think there are some very specific things happen when you actually cycle through the stages of sleep. But even getting rest, meaning, as my mom always said, the best form of rest is a change of activity. So really just being able to change up your day, change up what you're working on at any given time, that ended up being really important as well for your efficiency. It's very hard to micro sort of task, meaning going back and forth between these tasks. We're not very good at that, to multi several different things at the same time. We lose a fair amount of efficiency when we task switch. But changing up your activity from time to time actually does seem to make a huge difference.
I don't know if you've ever had Alex Soojung Kim Pang on your show. He wrote a book called Rest. He's been on this show.
No.
I'll put a link to him in the show notes. But
Okay.
he would be a good guest. He has a very, sort of broad, capacious understanding of what rest is that seems to jibe with what your mom says, that it doesn't necessarily mean lying in a hammock, although that is rest. But it could also, exercise, in Alex's view, is rest because it's a change of activity.
Right. Yeah. Somehow moms are always right. First of all, that's the headline. But also the idea that it doesn't have, it can be physical. It can be a physical activity still that would be from a brain standpoint be defined as rest. So you can have the brain really active when you're asleep, and you can have the brain very rested when you're very active. It's counterintuitive.
So would you put meditation would you put that under rest or stretching the mind?
I would put it more under rest for me. And I'm sure maybe people would give different answers on this, but the same sort of benefits I get when I am resting, I get from meditation as well. So that's why I sort of put it into that same bucket. It's always a change of activity, I guess, at the time, because I'm doing something else and I set aside time to meditate. So maybe that's why it's a form of rest as well. But I feel like I have the same benefits as if I had just truly rested in the hammock as you described.
You wrote an excellent piece on CNN.com, and I'll put a link to it. It was about this extraordinary opportunity you got to meditate one-on-one in the middle of the night or very, very early morning with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Can you tell that story here?
Sure. So this happened in Mungad, India. And as you may know, Dan, the Dalai Lama is very interested in some of the same stuff we're talking about. He's got a brain consortium that he's put together, and he's also he's a visiting professor at my university. So when he comes to the States, he will give lectures and stuff at my university. And then, so we got to know each other a bit. And I think the sort of substrate, the common substrate was our shared fascination for the brain. So he invited me to go to Mungad, and I took my wife, and, extraordinary sort of opportunity, as you say, and attended a couple of lectures that he gave, mostly to neuroscientists, about the inflection points, if you will, between meditation and brain health. And then we had lunch with him, and he asked me if I wanted to meditate with him the next morning. And it's a very daunting thing to sort of, it's kind of like he's the guy, he's the world class, in this case, meditator. But think about the world class baseball player or whatever, and then you want to go hit with me, or golfer. And so it was a little intimidating. But he starts his day super early, as you mentioned, I think around 3:45 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And he meditates for about 3.5 hours. And so 4 to 7 or 4 to 7:30 around there. Then he sort of takes his shower, has some breakfast and things like that. And then he meditates again until 9 o'clock. And then he starts his sort of official day. So I showed up there and, his folks took me into where he was meditating already and sat down. He was sort of on this little ledge, so I was sort of looking up at him. So the whole thing was like this very, very, felt very spiritual. It was a very spiritual experience. And I was sitting on the floor, and I can't even, for an Indian guy, I can't even sit cross-legged that well. It's embarrassing, Indian styles they call it. I can't even, like, my hips hurt when I do this for a long time. So I'm doing this, and he there's not a lot of instruction. It's just like, okay, now you meditate. So I'm doing this, and I'm trying to really do it, and I'm having a really, frankly, hard time. The whole situation feels uncomfortable, frankly, and I keep looking up at him, with one eye sort of open, and he's deep in his meditation. He's really, like, the breathing has gotten slower and just everything. Then one time I look up at him, and he's looking right at me. I don't know if you've heard him speak. He's got this very deep voice, and he's like, how's it going, or something like that. And I'm like, it's not going so well. I just can't seem to, I'm having a really hard time with this. And he basically told me, Dan, that he had a hard time meditating as well for a significant number of years. He's been the Dalai Lama since he was 2 or 3 years old, very young. But when he was really starting to meditate in earnest, he said he had a hard time with it. And he gave me some tips, which I thought were really helpful. And he sort of referred to it as a type of analytical meditation. So he was sitting there explaining this to me. He said, a lot of people will want to clear their mind. And that's actually a really hard thing to do for most people, to actually clear your mind. Other people will think about single point meditation. Like, I will think about a waterfall. I'll think about a point on the horizon or something, which it can work, but it can be challenging. But instead, to lean deeply into something that you're already thinking about, really deeply into a problem you're trying to solve, a book you just read, whatever it might be, and spend a lot of time just making a bubble around that thing. Because when you make the bubble around that thing, it forces you to define it. Because if it doesn't fit in the bubble, you haven't defined it well. So once the problem is X, okay, now I've really defined it and put it in the bubble. Because I hadn't really defined it before. I kept commingling it with other unrelated issues. Now the bubble is there, and you got it totally defined in there, whatever the problem is you're trying to solve. And now let the bubble float up. And the purpose of letting it float up, he said, was to sort of further disentangle it from emotional attachments. Just look at this problem in isolation, well-defined, hovering above you a little bit. You can spin it in your mind. You can do whatever. And when you spend the time to first really put it in the bubble and imagine the walls of the bubble sort of really enveloping the problem, and then spend some time just letting it sort of float up on you. And, I close my eyes for that meditation, and it might take me 15 minutes just to get to that point where I've now levitated the bubble in front of me. And then I just spend another 10 minutes or so spinning the bubble around, letting the problem sort of, become increasingly defined. And I think solutions sometimes emerge, or maybe things not to do, not to overreact to it, or whatever it might be. I find it really helpful. I find it really helpful for my life, and I never really thought about that sort of deep thinking as a form of meditation. But again, that's something I got to learn from the Dalai Lama, which was pretty cool. That was pretty cool.
Yes, it is. I did an interview with the Dalai Lama about where we talked a little bit about analytical meditation, so I'll drop a link to that in the show notes for people who want to learn more. But back to you, Dr. Gupta. In your
call
essay,
me Sanjay now, can't you? Or do I have to call you Mr. Harris?
Back to
Mr.
you,
Harris.
Sanjay. In your essay that I referenced on CNN.com, you wrote the following sentence. I just want to read it to you and get you to talk a little bit about it. You write, "In the past, my family and friends would have typically described me as pleasant but hurried. My baseline restlessness and edginess, however, have now nearly vanished." That was a few years ago. Are you still meditating? And are you still seeing the same effects?
Yeah, I meditate every day, at least 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah, Dan, you know what? I think that if we were doing this podcast before I started analytically meditating, it would have been a different podcast. I think I kind of always felt hurried. Even if I wasn't necessarily hurried, I felt that I'm missing something. Why am I not hurried? I have to be hurried. I should be hurried about something. I should be sort of in a rush to do something. And I'm really not as much anymore. I'm not sure that, look, to be fair, I don't want to attribute that all to analytical meditation. I think there's like these ripple effects that come from it, and some of it's probably age as well. But the idea of meditating for me, first of all, it allows me to think deeply for at least 15 or 20 minutes a day, which I think is just, it's like opening up the engine on your mind, just letting it go out for a joyride, number one. But number two is the fact that I can do it and just carve out even those 20 minutes in my day kind of give me some sense of control. Like I feel like, hey, if I can do this, I'm not totally out of control here, that I've just lost my schedule altogether. I can really sit down and do something that's very, very, I think, healing, frankly, for me and my brain. And I can just find that time every day. So that alone is really beneficial.
I thought about getting a tattoo that says unhurried, just to remind me that that's the state I want to be in, because the rushing brain is a dumber brain than the calm one.
As I mentioned, I have 3 daughters. I asked one of my daughters, I think she was around 12 years old. I was like one of those dinner time sort of, family dinners, which are always fun. And somehow the idea of future partners came up. And I was like, what are you looking for? And without a single trace of irony in her voice, she looks at me and she goes, "Someone who's not in a hurry." And I said, I don't know if that's an indictment of your dad or like where that came from exactly, but I love it.
Wise response.
She's a wise one for sure.
There's something about whatever form of meditation you're doing, I think, for some people, myself for sure, there's something about taking yourself out of the forward momentum for 5, 10, 15 minutes a day to meditate in, again, whatever form, that I think at least turns the dial down on the toppling forward.
Yeah.
That's my experience.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I know you don't do evolutionary biology, but have you ever read the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers?
I'm familiar with the book, and I think we've talked quite a bit about having its author. Is it something with a Z?
Robert Sapolsky.
Yeah, we've talked about having him on the show.
He's great. I've been lucky enough to talk to him a few times, sometimes for shows, but sometimes just to catch up with the guy. He's fascinating. But here's the point. The title of the book, it's a thick book, but the title sort of says it all. Zebras don't get ulcers. And the reason they don't get ulcers is because when they're being chased as potential prey, they're running their hearts out. But as soon as they're no longer being chased, they're happily grazing. So they can go from being super stressed to super relaxed just like that. We humans are not very good at that. This is the point Sapolsky makes, is that stress in and of itself is not the enemy. When I'm not meditating, there are moments of tremendous stress in my life. But stress is not the enemy. In fact, we need it. Get you out of bed, study for a test, do better at your job, whatever. But the relentless nature of the stress is the problem. And so, just to your point, Dan, I mean, meditating for me first of all, I really honestly will not check my phone for those 20 minutes. And you have it seems like a lifetime to not look at your phone for 20 minutes in the middle of a work day, right? Or end of a work day, whatever it might be. Hope my bosses aren't listening. But the idea that you just have that true break from the stress, I think is really important. Cortisol levels go down, Stress is not the problem. It's just that we never can get away from it. Meditating helps me a lot.
The fourth pillar is fuel your brain. What do you mean by that?
Well, the most strategic signal we give to the inside of our body from our outside world every day is our food. It's the food we eat. Obviously, the air we breathe as well, but we don't have as much sort of domain over that. It's the food. And so how we nourish ourselves has a tremendous impact, obviously, in our bodies, but also our brains. And some of it is non-intuitive. I think the idea that the microbiome, which so many people have written amazing books about, is so important for our brain health is well known. But I think the idea that, for example, we make more serotonin in our gut than in our brains is something that's not as well known. So much of our mood, how we feel, how likely we are to try something new as a result of how we feel, whatever it may be, our optimism is a result of our gut health, even more than our brain health. So paying really close attention, again, like, as I was talking about with the journaling, everyone's different. But you will get a sense if you journal what kind of foods are your sort of superfoods that you're going to feel really good 2 to 3 hours later in terms of your mood. Just got to pay attention to this. We don't draw the connection so easily, so that's why the journaling helps. But then there's other things about the way that we nourish ourselves that I think are pretty unique to the brain. So, for example, sugar. Everyone knows that too much sugar is bad for you. That's no surprise. What is interesting is that when you eat a lot of calories in the form of sugar, a lot of energy in the form of sugar, your body will, as you know, just basically store it. Assuming that the body functions from this aspect of, I don't know when I'm going to get my next meal, so I got a bunch of energy here, a bunch of calories here, let me store that, store it as fat. We all know that. What is different about the brain, though, is that when you raise, it's a very narrow window of absorption in the brain. So as soon as you get the glucose levels too high in the bloodstream, instead of absorb, the receptors just turn off in the brain. So you could be stuffing your body and starving your brain simultaneously. It's part of why people crash. You eat a bunch of sugar and then you crash because the brain receptors essentially turned off. They're not absorbing the extra energy. They've decided to absorb no energy because you've exceeded the therapeutic or the sort of the window of what the brain is willing to accept from a glucose standpoint. So that's just an example of the what and the why again. Again, we know sugar is bad, but here it gets really fine-tuned when it comes to the brain. You need some sugar in your diet. That's energy. But as soon as you get too high, you can actually get into the point where you're starving your brain. And part of the mechanisms go on, which I won't get into, but you may have heard that people have started to come to think of dementia sort of as type 3 diabetes. And a lot of this has to do with how we think about sugar's impact on the brain. So it's something to sort of just keep in mind when we nourish ourselves, we're nourishing our microbiome, we're nourishing obviously our brain, but all these systems are working sort of in different ways, and we have to sort of pay attention to that.
Do you have specific recommendations when it comes to how to eat?
Yeah, don't eat too much. Eat mostly plants, eat real foods. I think most of our medical problems, frankly, in the United States, 70% of our $4 trillion healthcare budget is due to just poor eating. Some of it, a lot of it, I would say, is probably not our fault. I mean, you can eat the same meals in Europe that you eat here and have a totally different experience. You'd have fewer calories, you'd have fewer additives, you'd feel better. Have a huge pasta dinner in Italy and you won't gain any weight and you'll feel great. It's like I use an app. I don't know if I'm allowed to plug apps, but I like this app called Yuka, Yuka. I use it to basically scan my food and tell me what's in it. And if there's too many additives and preservatives, things that I know are going to make me feel pretty crummy a couple hours after I eat it, I don't eat it. It's not that it's not tasty, it's just that I know now, because I'm a deep observer of my own sort of things through journaling, what kind of foods don't make me feel well. These aren't allergies per se. I just don't feel well when I eat those things. So I think the biggest thing is don't eat too much, eat mostly plants, pay attention to what you're eating, recognize that a lot of the additives, which you may not be aware of, you should become aware of. And then understand which of those are really bad for you in terms of your overall productivity and your mood. That's basically it. I like food. I eat food, and I like to go out to dinners and stuff like that, but I plan and I pay attention to it, I think, certainly more than I used to.
Right. I mean, the tricky thing there is, in my experience, one can get pretty obsessive about food and how your body looks in ways that I don't know how it ramifies in the brain, but it's just not good for your psyche.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Being a dad of 3 teenage girls, it's something I think about a lot as well. And luckily, we have very open, candid conversations in our family about those topics. But I think, what I think surprises me sometimes is people will talk about calories and things like that, which is an important measure. But I think how food actually makes you feel. If the food that you eat makes you more likely to want to go out and do something active later on, that's the kind of food you should be eating, as opposed to the kind of food that may be really tasty but makes you just very sluggish. Most people just never pay attention to it. So spend a week, just 1 week, eating your normal diet, and then 2 hours later and 3 hours later, just creating a little checklist for yourself. How do I feel? How productive am I? Am I sleepy? Do I think I could go out and do something right now? Could I be active? Whatever, am I in a good mood? Do I want to go hang around my kids and just be fun dad for a while? Whatever it might be. That is something that I think it's incredible insight for yourself. So that's kind of it on food. I mean, there's a lot to say about food, obviously. Again, I think most chronic diseases in this country in some way or another are related to how we nourish ourselves. I think there is, for a certain percentage of people, no matter what they do in terms of eating right and exercising and everything, they have a really hard time losing weight. And again, some of it may not be their fault, because even though they think they're eating well, they're eating foods that may have a lot of preservatives in them and other things. But I think another thing that we're seeing in this new weight loss drug revolution has sort of taught us is that for some people, they may not be making the same amount of hormones after they eat that you or I do. You eat a meal and then you release a bunch of post-nutrient hormones, they're called. And these hormones stimulate your pancreas to make insulin. They tell your brain that you are full, and they slow down your gut so that you can actually digest the food you just ate. Some people probably just don't make enough of that. And so they don't ever really feel full. And they constantly have this food chatter. They're already thinking about their next meal, even as they finish the one that they just ate. When you look at these new drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy and Mounjaro, in some ways they're replacing those hormones and allowing the body to do what it should be doing, telling the brain that you're full after you've eaten, making a little bit more insulin, which helps diabetics, and slowing down your gut a little bit so that you can actually absorb the calories as opposed to it just moving through you quickly. I'm not saying those drugs are for everyone, but I do think that they can play a real role for people. 40% of our country is obese right now. 40%. I don't think you probably knew anybody who was obese when you were growing up, or maybe very few. Now almost, 4 in 10 people, which is incredible.
On this question of fueling the brain, where are you on alcohol?
I don't really drink. I was never a big drinker. Doing 7 years of residency is working 100 hours a week. I think, drinking became something that was just so obstructive to me being able to do anything. I have drank. It's not like I have no moral quandary with it. And I probably will have some drinking this Friday because there's a big event my wife and I have to go to. So I'll probably have a couple glasses of wine. So it's not like I'm totally against it, but I pay the price the next day. I probably won't do the morning run as early, or if at all, probably won't sleep as well. So I'm not a big drinker. How about you?
I stopped drinking just because I developed, I don't know if allergy is the right term, but if I have so much as a sip of alcohol, I feel hungover immediately.
Ugh.
It's not like the next morning. I just go right to the hangover. So it just doesn't agree with me. So I don't
Some
do
people
it.
call that being drunk. You call it a hangover.
No, because I know what it's like to be drunk, and that can be, well, or at least buzzed, and that can be mildly pleasant, but there's nothing pleasant about this.
Got it. Okay.
I think it could be nature's way of protecting me, because I have some very prominent alcohol abuse disorder in my lineage. So, and I'm glad for this allergy, or whatever you want to call it, this intolerance.
It sounds like you developed it later in life, but there is a thing known as, there's alcohol dehydrogenase, which is what breaks down alcohol. And some people don't have enough of that enzyme that breaks it down. So it ends up being, gets to toxic level pretty quickly, which makes people feel pretty miserable. Certain populations, you'll see it because their skin will turn bright red right as soon as they even have a sip of alcohol. It's a lack of that enzyme. So maybe you have that. Not that you need to get tested or anything, because I think it's working for you. So
yeah, I'm good. All right. Well, so the fifth pillar, not entirely unrelated to alcohol, because alcohol is often consumed with others. The fifth pillar is connecting with others. So what's the connection between connecting with others and the health of our brain?
From a sort of strictly functional standpoint, when you are actually part of a community and connecting with others regularly, you do tend to make more oxytocin, which is a particular hormone. It's some have referred to it as the cuddle hormone. Moms make a lot of it when they have baby, and cuddling with baby makes you very empathetic towards people, but it also acts synergistically with that BDNF that I was talking about earlier. So having cultivated connections, making the more oxytocin, can help that process of neurogenesis. That's the dot connecting on that. But I think, what is interesting about it is that defining what that means is I think where the area of research has really gone here. A lot of the researchers who study loneliness, for example, using that to sort of say, well, what can we then construe about the impact of loneliness on the brain, but also the impact of connection on the brain, and are they the opposite of one another? And what you find is that they're not necessarily. I was never a particularly social person, especially when I was growing up, and then during medical school and residency. I think you got to get pretty siloed. So I wasn't so being social was sort of seen as an extravagance to me, a luxury. I had something to do if I didn't have anything else that I should be doing, as opposed to something that had real value. And I think it was during the pandemic that I realized that I was not feeling very good when I was isolated. I just wasn't around people. And I was like, wow, even though I'm not a very social person, I miss actually being around people. And so when I started to be around people again, it scratched that itch. I felt better from that. What I think is interesting, though, is that, like, what does it mean to have a strong social connection with somebody? Like, how do you define that? If it's not the quantity of those connections, it's the quality. How do you define the quality of something? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that when I was writing the book. And I'm not sure I think it's different for everybody, but people have their criteria. Like, do you have a few people in your life beyond family that you could call, in the middle of the night with a problem? Can you identify those people? Things like that. And it made me realize when I read all these papers on it that every paper in some way was showcasing a part of vulnerability. Like, can you be vulnerable around somebody was really what they were getting at. Calling about your problems is one way to demonstrate vulnerability. Asking for help is one way to demonstrate vulnerability. When I put it all together for me, when I was thinking about that, I realized, for example, with my parents, I would call them, they're both in their early 80s, and say, how you doing? And they'd say, well, we're doing fine. How you doing? well, I'm also doing fine, and it was like this kind of superficial conversation. I love my parents. We're very, very close. But at the time, not sure I would have defined our connection as really, really deep. And so I put into practice a little bit of this concept. And the next time I spoke to them, they're both automotive engineers. They're retired now, but they were automotive engineers. I said, oh, by the way, my wife, Rebecca, she's had a little trouble with her car lately. There was a little smoke coming from underneath the hood. Oh, my parents both put on their reading glasses and FaceTime us, and, I had the hood open and I'm showing them the thing, and they're like pulling out their manual, and I'm not sure that they helped at all. But the next morning they called again about it. And the point is not obviously what they did for the car, but all of a sudden we were having a more profound conversation about things. I had showed vulnerability to them, and, I'm still their son, and they still want to be able to help me and feel like they can be of help to me. I tell you that story just as a sort of an example of developing profound connections. If you can be vulnerable around somebody, ask them for help is a hack in a way to demonstrating vulnerability. So, I told my mom when I finished writing the book, I said, if I had to distill it down for you, I would say, take a brisk walk with a close friend and talk about your problems. That kind of gets at this idea of really developing strong connections with people. And there's a lot of evidence as to why that's good for your brain.
Something I repeat, this is not an original insight on my part at all, but a phrase that I repeat over and over because it's so resonant and it's right on point, I think, to what you're talking about. Robert Waldinger, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love him.
Just for the uninitiated, he is the current head of something called the Harvard Study for Adult Development, which has been running for 8 or 9 decades in the Boston area, where they've looked at successive generations of Bostonians to figure out what are the variables that lead to a long and healthy life. And number one is the quality of your relationships.
Yeah.
And the mechanism for that is that relationships help you reduce stress, and stress is what kills. And Dr. Waldinger's pithy little exhortation is never worry alone. That seems to be like the actionable advice under this 5th pillar of social connections.
It's funny. I had not heard that. I really like that. And it's right, because I read the, again, I'm forgetting the title of the recent book he wrote, but I read that, and I followed the Harvard study, and I think he's the third person to run the study, right, over 80 years or something. And such an interesting guy. He's pretty, but never worry alone. I like that. I think I do worry alone. I don't know. I'm probably not very good at that now that I'm sitting here thinking about it. Do you worry alone, or do you immediately share your worries with your family, or with who?
I don't want to say I never worry alone, but I rarely worry. My instinct is to ask for advice, to do what you're describing, and I've made it a deliberate practice as I've gotten older to really be very intentional about developing, cultivating, and maintaining relationships. And one aspect of that is if I have a problem, I'll talk to my wife, I talk to my brother. I have a bunch of my colleagues, friends. Yeah, I have a lot of people I could call in the middle of the night.
I think the balance sometimes, I don't want to saddle my wife with my worries, and I don't know if you ever covered conflicts as part of your journalistic career. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, I have.
You had this intense experience, and you probably wanted to share, but at the same time, I felt like it would be too emotionally disturbing to saddle my wife with some of that. And she was just happy that I was back in one piece, So the idea of then, not that she would worry because I'm back, but it's one of those things I'm going to have to think about the not worrying alone thing. I definitely have friends that I call for simpler things. These big life sort of worries, existential things. I try not to saddle people with, but I'm going to have to think about the never worry alone thing. You've given me something to think about.
I think it's possible that an error in your thinking might be embedded in this word choice of saddle. Because when somebody comes to me with a problem, I don't view it as an imposition, generally. This is not an invitation for everybody listening to email me with all of your problems. But if I have a friend who comes to me and asks for advice, that can release a non-trivial amount of dopamine. People like to be asked for advice.
True.
I get also some oxytocin released because I I feel honored that somebody would confide in me. I'm not sure if we had your wife on the horn that she would view it as being saddled with something.
I think you're right. That might be more my perception than the reality. The only distinction I think I would make is if there's sometimes there's things that I worry about that there's really no actionable. There's no advice to be given. It feels it's not that it's even necessarily big. It's just that I'm just worried, you know? I worry about the world. I worry about what's happening geopolitically. I worry about these things. And I have an intellectual conversations with my wife about it, but I think the idea, especially for some people, depending on, how you were raised, you want to project optimism, more than saying, hey, I'm really worried about how things are going in the world right now. So I don't know. I'm probably not saying this very artfully, but just, I'm thinking out loud with you. But I think the idea of worrying alone, sometimes keeping some of it to yourself, if there's not something that can be done by the other person, may be beneficial. But I think to your point, it actually can be, the other person may feel good that you've just shared this with them. Yes. And it strengthens the relationship.
Sort of in a very friendly way, disagree with the notion that it might be not beneficial to share problems for which there is no solution with somebody else, because actually what people want generally when they're sharing anxiety from you is just an empathetic witness. Yes. They want validation. They just want to feel like they're not crazy for worrying about this. They want to be heard, seen, understood. That's generally what they want. If you go quickly to the advice, that can be annoying.
My daughters have shared that with me. Yes, because I think if they're sharing something with me, I must be required to fix it in some way.
Yes,
and I think it took some time for me, and my oldest is now 19 years old, so it probably took 18 years for me to sort of figure out that exactly as you're saying, Dan, all she wanted was an empathetic ear.
Yes,
to smile and nod and keep silent, absorb, but not to necessarily fix was really helpful.
Brene Brown, the great sociologist and author and incredible communicator, she was on the show once and she said something about with her own kids, it's like, I can't fix this problem, but I can sit in the dark with you. That, I feel like, encapsulates what I'm trying to say.
I really like that. And look, this is a good conversation because I think even at this age, we grow, I think I'm probably transitioning from the guy that's willing to sort of keep it more buckled in under my own sort of brain and body and not share as much, and also be the guy that feels that he needs to offer up a solution / fix for any problem that I'm dealt with. And I probably need to think about different ways to handle both those situations, share more and fix less.
Yeah. I mean, dude, I mean, just to cut you some slack here, I think there are two factors that would make this more difficult for you. One is we're both Gen X males. We were not conditioned for this kind of, we were raised to be barbarians. We were raised on the Beastie Boys screaming about, conquest with women, et cetera, et cetera. It was not an enlightened era in which we came of age. And so the second thing to say is that, you work on the news. It's not a medium that encourages this kind of rawness and realness. And I know it intimately from the inside. So I hope you're not telling yourself too self-critical of a story.
Well, no, I really appreciate that. I don't feel like I'm being self-critical, but it's funny when your only context. This kind of conversation is very interesting because how many times do guys like you and I really sit down and have a conversation like this? So the only context that I've really had for this is me. I didn't have anything else to compare it to. It's not like I'm Chris Cuomo and I are hanging out saying, "Hey, man, so do you share your worries with Are you Mr. Fix It? We don't have those conversations. It's not. He's actually a good friend of mine, but I'm saying that these conversations don't happen. So how do you get the context of life sometimes? From your parents, I guess, to some extent, but friends, close friends. But even then, people don't usually have these kinds of conversations. So you end up learning a lot.
I actually have tried to make it my business to have these conversations I have 3 or 4 groups of men who I have standing dinner or lunch dates with, and actually one group of where I'm the only man and it's all women. Yeah, we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. One of these groups has been running since 2008.
Incredible.
Yes.
That's incredible.
And so I mean, I've gotten much more intentional about this later in life and after I retired from the news. It has made a huge difference. And I think for men in particular, and I think there's some data around this, men have fewer friends, and that leads to more loneliness and depression and anxiety and all that stuff. And I think for men in particular, we're getting all these messages. Men are about optimizing. Huberman's telling us to, get extra sleep and track our calories and all that stuff. But nobody's talking about optimizing the one thing that actually is the most powerful lever, which is the quality of our relationships. And I actually think, then I'm on my hobby horse. I actually think this is a thing that many more men should be thinking about.
I agree. I agree. And I would put myself in the bucket of one of those men that should be thinking about it more. I write about it. People who are introverts may be less likely to do this. People who have spent so much of their time, so many hours of my most formative years of my life were literally spent in a windowless operating room under a microscope.
Yeah.
That is my life, and it's built for not being distracted.
Yeah.
You're built for huge attention to very small things. And so it makes for fun, deep conversations, but not as likely to have large groups of friends, So I have friends. Don't get me wrong. I'm not some total curmudgeon who's, very isolated, but not like you have. And so I demand an invitation to one of these lunches or whatever if I'm up in your neck of the woods.
You may regret that.
No, I think I'd love it.
Done. I've really held you much longer than I thought I was going to, but this has been a total pleasure. Before I let you go, can you just remind everybody of the names of the books you've written and the podcast you host and the network on which you report? Just plug everything, please.
Well, thank you. So I've written Chasing Life, Cheating Death, Monday Mornings, Keep Sharp, and World War C, 5 books, and a couple of workbooks in there as well. Work on CNN. I'm the chief medical correspondent there. My day job is a neurosurgeon. I'm a neurosurgeon at Emory Clinic, Emory University in Atlanta. And the podcast is Chasing Life. So the funny thing is it was named after my first book, although the first book was back, in 2008. So thought that name went away and it came back in the podcast, and we've been doing it for some 10 seasons now. So
amazing.
A lot of fun.
Huge pleasure to meet you, albeit virtually. Thank you for spending all this time with me. Appreciate it.
What a pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me.